Hello. We're in the middle of Highland Games season here in the north of Scotland, and Saturday the 16th of July 2022 sees the return of Inverness Highland Games after an enforced 2-year break due to COVID. Ahead of the day, we thought it would be interesting to share with you the story of Highland Games activity in and around Inverness, the various iterations that that's taken, and the reason why, even though there were Highland Games held not far from Inverness in 1822, nevertheless, the 2022 Inverness Highland Games do not mark the 200th anniversary of Highland Games in Inverness. So, what were those 1822 games then, and why aren't they the forerunners, the predecessors of the current Inverness Highland Games? Well, my name's Lorna Steele-McGinn. I'm the Community Engagement Officer for the Highland Archive Service, and I'm here to tell you a little bit about that story. For many years in and around Inverness, there had been local race meets for horse racing, but there had been no purpose-made or designated racecourse. And in the early 1800s, the Northern Meeting set about changing that by creating a purpose-built racecourse at Dinane Croy, around 3 miles outside the boundaries of Inverness Borough. And it was here that those 1822 games were held. The Northern Meeting was and is a pan-Highland organisation formed in 1788 with the aim of bringing together the gentlemen of the Highlands and their families for an annual week of social activities, regardless of their affiliation during the Jacobite risings. Although the Northern Meeting had pushed for the creation of the racecourse, they were not the driving force behind holding Highland Games on the site, although they did provide some financial support. That role of driving the desire for the games forward actually was taken up by one Alistair Ranaldson MacDonnell, 15th of Glengarry. And the games that he organised in 1822 were known variously as the Glengarry Games and the True Highland Games. Those 1822 games were one of a series that MacDonnell of Glengarry had organised around different parts of the north of Scotland. The 1822 games were particularly brutal, and they bear really very little resemblance to what we see at Highland Games today and what we associate with Highland Games. Contemporary reports record an 8-mile race where the first 4 runners arrived at their goal in the costume of Adam. So they were scalping naked, apparently. One of the heavy events was the throwing of an 18-stone boulder over a 5-foot bar. So perhaps that's something slightly more recognisable to us. The most astonishing thing, and certainly the most unpalatable thing to our modern ears, was the fact that at these 1822 games, there was a competition between teams of men to try and tear the legs off a cow which had been felled and stunned with a sledgehammer. The aim going forward for those games was that in the future there would be a competition to see if you could eat some of that raw meat as well. So very, very unlike what we associate with the Highland Games today. So that's the 1822 games. They were held 3 miles outside the borough boundary, and also they were led by one Glengarry and his Society of True Highlanders. So therefore we can't really see those as the route, as the predecessors of the current Inverness Highland Games. And so if they're not the predecessors, then what are the other contenders? Well, in 1837, there were Highland Games held in Inverness itself, organised this time by the Northern Meeting. At the Highland Archive Centre, we hold the records of the Northern Meeting, from which a history was written, which we also hold, a book by Angus Ferry. And here's how that book records those first games in Inverness in 1837. The first official games organised by the Northern Meeting were held on the Longman in a field owned by Mr. Wilson of the Caledonian Hotel. The industrial estate which covers the fields of the Longman today makes it difficult to visualise the scene. And those games comprise things that we would associate much more now with the Highland Games. Heavy and field events, wheelbarrow races, sack races, shooting, and other events. And musket shooting was one of the main events. And these games went from strength to strength over the following years, with events like hurdles, pony races, steeple chases, and various other things added in to build what was happening at the games. And it provided a huge amount of fun and a huge amount of social activity, both for members of the public and for members of the Northern Meeting. The games moved from the Longman to a yard on the back of Inverness Royal Academy, which is off Academy Street, Struthers Lane area. And then after a brief stint in Farrelline Park, what's now Inverness bus station, the Northern Meeting purchased land in 1864, creating the Northern Meeting Park and subsequently erecting on that site the pavilion that still stands on the site today. These games, held at the Northern Meeting Park in September and organised by the Northern Meeting, were a huge success and have been called the most popular annual event in Inverness, with competitors travelling from far and near to take part. And we can see this in the collections of the Northern Meeting that we hold. We can see evidence of competitors from everywhere from America to right across Scotland. Mid-Calder, Stirling and Arran are examples that are on this image, as well as a good supply always of military personnel competing from Fort George and other nearby military bases. It was clearly a huge event of huge local importance, and we can see that from other collections as well, not just the Northern Meeting collections. The Inverness Constabulary police records record that one Constable Walter Scott was on special duty at the Northern Meeting in September 1893. And he was reported for misconduct after being under the influence of drink and absenting himself without leave. Now, it's clear that sometimes the event was of such a scale that it required police to be brought in from elsewhere. And the Ross and Cromarty Constabulary records show that on the 23rd of September 1910, Constable Peter Smith was on special duty, having been brought in from another constabulary. But perhaps not that surprisingly, he appeared to be also under the influence of drink and appeared at the local police station a bit worse for wear and was reported for misconduct. So we start to see how important and how much a social activity these Northern Meeting Games were. So, started in 1837, can they be seen then as the start of today's Inverness Highland Games? Well, it's actually still not that simple. The Northern Meeting Games ran for around 100 years, with great highs and some lows. There were new events and activities added. There were royal visits, as you can see in this image. This is the Duke of York in the centre of the picture, with Colonel Hugh Rose and General Ross at the Northern Meeting Games in September 1920. So there were some times of great celebration and great achievement, but there were also some times of hardship, organisational difficulties and financial problems. The 1930s saw a period of difficulty and decline for the Northern Meeting Games, with both local and national circumstances having an effect. Many other aspects of the Northern Meeting programme weren't really affected by the political and social changes of the early 1930s. You'll remember these Highland Games were set up really as just part of a week of the Northern Meeting social calendar. And the Games were affected in ways that other parts of that schedule just weren't. So the torrential summer rains that happened in the early 1930s didn't stop the Northern Meeting Ball for the members, but it did impact the Games taking place. The Invergordon Mutiny and the general discontent in the Navy didn't have any impact on the Northern Meeting member events, but did strip the Games of many of the military competitors and spectators who would usually have attended. The Games' finances were badly hit as a result of all of these things. And Inverness residents gradually began to be lured to other events happening in the town. The committee tried a number of things, including writing to the Navy to officially request that they schedule manoeuvres for the week of the Games so that sailors could attend. They tried moving the Games from the traditional September period to August because they could see that people were travelling in August for their holidays, and that maybe the solution was to separate them away from the rest of the Games, the rest of the Northern Meeting activity. They tried changing the Games from a professional event to an amateur meet, but all of these things were to no avail, as this extract from the Northern Meeting history reveals. At the time, the change of date to improve attendance and the switch to amateur games, which would be organised by trained officials, seemed to have solved the Northern Meeting's problem. But one fundamental matter had been overlooked. The whole point in the Northern Meeting running the Games was to entertain its members and their house parties on the days of the ball. Moving the date of the Games forward to August certainly improved the crowds a bit, but the Games ceased to be an occasion for the members' social gathering, and allowing the Amateur Athletic Association to officiate meant that there was no need for the lairds to run the Games anymore. If members had no interest in attending the Games, they certainly had no interest in underwriting them. In 1938, torrential rain returned to the Games, and the attendance dropped to its lowest level ever. A loss of £271, which would be some tens of thousands today, the loss of interest of the members of the Northern Meeting, and indeed the lack of incentive to hold the Games at all, brought matters to a head. Some last-ditch discussions with local shopkeepers did bring a possible formula for survival, when the Shopkeepers Association, the Licensed Trades Association and the Town Council each agreed, somewhat reluctantly, to bear 25% of any future losses. But by then, life was fast ebbing away from the Games. The last straw came when it was discovered that proposed dates for the 1939 Games clashed with the Nairn Games, and the Games Committee decided to cancel the Games. And so, just over 100 years after their start, the Northern Meeting Games came to an end. In the event, the magnitude of international events of August 1939 meant that they slipped away almost unnoticed, as once again members were turning their attention to their military responsibilities. And so from 1938, Inverness was once again without the Highland Games, and of course the declaration of war in 1939 sealed that unlikelihood of any immediate revival. Theoretically, people wanted there to be a Highland Games in Inverness, but no one wanted to take on the responsibility of actually doing the organising. And therefore, this image from the 1938 Northern Meeting Games showing the bicycle race is the final one of that series. Following World War II, a decision was taken by the Northern Meeting to sell the Northern Meeting Park, and that sale to the Inverness Town Council was completed in August 1946 at a cost of £5,750, which is over 200,000 in today's money. So we end the Northern Meeting period in 1938. In 1947, Highland Games started up again in Inverness under new leadership and under the new name of the Inverness Gathering. Not professional, but an amateur sport, an amateur meet, with competitions arranged by the North of Scotland Amateur Athletic Society. It was a new type of games, so it was no longer part of a wider schedule of events for one membered organisation, but instead was organised by the people of Inverness for the people of Inverness. And this is the meeting. This is the Games that can be said perhaps to be the start of today's Inverness Highland Games 75 years ago. The 1947 Games also saw the start of something else of local importance. Local councillor and prominent community man Tom Mackenzie was so inspired by the 1947 Games that he and two others, Donald McCleary and Alex Cameron, formed the Inverness Harriers, the first athletics club in the Highland region, which went on to great success, particularly from the 1970s onwards, and is still very much going today. Following the 1947 introduction of the Inverness Gathering, the Games moved from the Northern Meeting Park to the Bucht Park, where they have largely remained, with some interludes back at the Northern Meeting Park. And I'm sure any locals who are watching will probably remember games at both locations. Over subsequent years, it was run by various bodies, including Inverness Amenities Association, Inverness District Council, and the Highland Council. In the Games' recent history, there have been some notable moments. In 1970, the Commonwealth Games were being held in Edinburgh, and a number of competitors were persuaded to make the journey from Edinburgh to the north to compete in the Inverness Games. In 1987, Alan Wells, who was the 1980 100-metre Olympic champion, came to Inverness to compete in the Inverness Highland Games, but apparently he had such a handicap imposed on him that he didn't make the final. He also entered the 200 metres without a handicap, which he did win. The Inverness Highland Games, like so many other things, have had an enforced break over the past 2 years, with COVID bringing an end to so many things. But it is returning to Bucht Park again this year in July, organised by High Life Highland, supported by the Inverness Highland Games Committee. We hope that some of you who are in the country or nearby will be able to attend this year's Inverness Highland Games, take part in the event, cheer on the competitors, and enjoy the day. But whether you can attend or not, hopefully this very short talk has allowed you to reflect on all the various Highland Games activities that have taken part over the centuries in and around Inverness. And I hope that you've enjoyed these images from the collections of the Highland Archive Centre and from the collections of Ambala, High Life Highland's Highland History and Culture website. Thank you for listening.